Okay, Tony here again for part 2 of the lecture on representation of sportswomen. So we're going to carry on looking at, so we kind of looked so far at things that might be fairly problematic about the way that we represent sportswomen. And so now what we're going to do is shift into some of those patterns, current patterns that actually are focused on similarity and actually treat women seriously. As well as some debates over sexualization and a new pattern that I've identified. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll go to the lecture. Okay. So this one we're going to focus on two key patterns that relate strongly to nationalism. So one of them is athletes in action, and the other one is what I'm calling serious athletes. So you can see that when we tend to get coverage of sportswomen, and this is particularly in the print media, and it's actually the same in broadcast media, because they, you know, when broadcast media actually broadcasts women, it is broadcasting them during their events. And so when women do get that 15% of coverage that they get, or 10% of coverage that they get, it usually does take them seriously. So in particular, we see them in action, which I think is really important. And then there is a lot more emphasis on them as real athletes or serious athletes. So there was one interesting thing in the New Zealand Olympic Committee in 2016 did a study, a full year-length study of media coverage of all the New Zealand Olympians leading up to and then during and just after the Olympic Games. But one of the things they did find, that it wasn't hugely significant, but there was much higher focus on celebration or emotion for the New Zealand sportswomen than there was for the sportsmen. And they did find a slightly lower percentage of action images of women than men. But overall, in pretty much all the studies around the world, when we do see photographs, they are showing, or images, we do see them in action, and it's fairly similar between men and women. It is the most common kind of image that we actually see. And we see news stories, you know, taking women's sports seriously. Vogue in 2016, leading up to the 2016 Olympics, actually, which they haven't always done in the past, they showed all the UK Olympians as athletes doing their sport on their bikes, etc., as you can see from the image here. And they called them the Team GB's Ultimate Girl Gang. All right. So again, the reason that they probably take women seriously is that often women erupt onto our media screens and pages when they're winning for the nation. So, and it's especially, we see the most coverage we see of sportswomen is during the Olympic or Commonwealth Games. So New Zealand research I've done shows that coverage of sportswomen jumps up to 26% during the Olympics. Overall coverage, you know, well up from its usual 10 or 11%. And then things like World Cups or World Championships, also we tend to see a big sort of small short-term jump in the media coverage of women. And at this point, my argument that I want to make is that they shift from being female athletes to being national citizens. And when they win, they become model citizens. And so therefore we use the rules of representation associated with national identity, not the rules of representation that are associated with femininity and being a female athlete. We'll see lots of our female athletes with flags and all those kinds of things that show that they're or in their uniforms that show, with the silver fern, that show they're competing for the nation. So, but what was really interesting, and I want to talk you through these two figures at the bottom that says us and them, and there are two layers to that. So the New Zealand Olympic Committee study found that sportswomen mattered most during the Olympics. So in their year-long study, they found that sportswomen received more coverage than men during the Olympics. So I can't actually show this here. So you can see that women received well, actually, it's almost equal, 48.4% and 49.7%. they were slightly more of the athletes than the men, and they did win more medals than men. So technically, they probably should have received even more coverage than they did. They're really similar during the event. So what happened was that men seemed to matter all the time. So media covered men a lot more in the lead up to the Olympics. They covered them during the Olympics, and they also covered the men a lot more after the Olympics, whereas the focus on the sportswomen was pretty much during the event itself, and then they dropped off completely. So, and this finding is quite similar to longitudinal USA research on nightly sports television news, which found the main researcher, Cheryl Cookie, who I know quite well, summarized this pattern in 2018 as it's never too early, too soon, or too late to talk about major men's sports. But the other thing about us and them is that it's only our women that matter. So if you look at the information actually in both on the left-hand side, you'll see if we look at the 2016 New Zealand team only, it's pretty even. So it's that 48.4% for the women and 49.7% for the men. But if we look at the coverage of the whole Olympic Games, we see that the coverage of women drops significantly. So what that tells us is that our men matter and our women matter. Their men also matter. So we're interested in the exploits and achievements of men from other countries, but their women don't matter. So we don't really care about the results or competitions of women from other nations. So that reinforces the idea that we're interested in our sportswomen because they're national citizens, not because they're female athletes. So it's really positive that it goes up, but it does reinforce the fact that you know, nationalism shoves gender off to the side, so that creates a space for coverage, and then once that's over, they go back to being female athletes and not of much interest. Okay, so let's move to some of the things that are changing. So one of the things that's happened is a kind of explosion of female voices on sport online. And this is a form of resistance to this ongoing marginalization, sexualization, and feminization of sportswomen. So it's been individual athletes, women's sports teams and events, groups of women, including athletes and journalists, making podcasts, setting up specific Twitter feeds, such as the one for the FIFA Women's World Cup, for example, Instagram, Facebook accounts, and some of them attract millions of followers. But what's very interesting to me is that the women who gain, or the sites that gain high social media following, like Maria Sharapova and Serena Williams there, who have millions of followers, they are generally athletes who have previously received high levels of corporate media coverage, so especially live coverage of their events. So people have come to know them through live media coverage, and then that translates in the ability to attract an audience online. But many of these other sites that have been set up by women athletes who aren't that famous, or by women's sports organizations or women activists, actually tend to be fairly niche. So they've got limited followers, and they often don't have particularly long lifespans. And certainly the research shows that the most followed online sports sites are still those ones like NBA.com, etc., that are focused on major men's sports. Down on the bottom left, I've put a couple of screenshots from surfer Alana Blanchard's Instagram page, because it's quite interesting that you could almost argue that she potentially sexualizes herself as part of her self-representation. So I analyzed 123 images off her Instagram feed a couple of years ago for a research article. 61% of them featured her in a bikini, but only 10% of the images were of her surfing. So, and of those 61% of the images of her in a bikini, 15% of them had a primary focus on her butt. So a bit like the earlier image of 15 athletes to follow on Twitter, it appears that there is something about her beautiful behind that potentially attracts interest. So, and the fact that only 10% of her images were of her surfing may not be something she has control over, because quite often she doesn't own those images and she may not have access to be able to use them and show them. But even if that's the case, her feed tends to emphasize the physical attractiveness of her body at the expense of her athletic ability. But what I want to argue or get you to actually think about is whether this is sexualization or whether it might be a new form of representation that I argue is emerging in the online space, which is the pretty and powerful female athlete. So this comes out of third wave feminism, and we're seeing this emergence of what I'm calling pretty and powerful, other people might call strong and sexy, female athletes. So rather than historically females were presented as either pretty or powerful, now we're starting to see this kind of integrated identity as I can be pretty, I can be feminine, but that doesn't get in the way of me being one of the top athletes in the world and being also recognized for my power and competence. So these women, as you can see from these two quotes, seem quite comfortable with enjoying being sexual or sexually attractive, while also being recognized as one of the best athletes in the world. And I really like the quote down the bottom, which says, "I find this Olympic gold medalist turned MMA star quite fascinating. When she's in the ring, she looks like such a badass. When she's out of the ring, she looks like your typical girly girl. There's something about that juxtaposition that's just awesome." So on a lot of media sites, especially those run by young men, I'm finding there's a real interest in these two dimensions of female athletes. So they don't see it as problematic that they're both feminine and can kick your ass, for example. And the women are exploiting these kinds of possibilities for their own purposes in some cases, because they're aware of the marketability of their bodies, and they exploit them for their own purposes, because perhaps women's sport still doesn't get the same amount of funding or sponsorship as men's sport. So the reading by Thorpe and Toffoletti and might actually help you understand why we shouldn't see this as completely positive, because the sportswomen may have less options than they think they have. So there may still be some oppressive elements in this that reinforce gender inequalities. So what do I mean by this rearticulation from pretty or powerful to pretty and powerful? So in cultural studies, if we want to break that articulation of men and masculinity, or break that understanding that you can be pretty or powerful into, and then bring it back into some kind of coherence, there are two things that have to happen. One is that traditional articulations have to become weakened. So the articulation of men and masculinity has to be a bit weaker than it was. And the second is the extent to which the new articulation borrows from or reworks traditional frameworks so they already appear somewhat familiar. So I'm going to suggest that these, both of these things are in play in the emergence of this pretty and powerful rule. So the traditional unquestioned articulation of sport and masculinity, I think, has been weakened by the sheer number of girls and women who are playing sport, visible increases in women's sport performance, such as the amazing performances at the FIFA Women's World Cup, for example, our New Zealand women's rugby sevens team, all those kinds of things. We're starting to see women, now they've got the opportunity and they've got some funding, they're actually playing at a really high level. And the other one is perhaps maybe the actions of researchers and women's sport activists in, challenging the marginalization of women's sport might be another element. And in addition, this articulation of pretty and powerful is connected to familiar cultural frameworks articulated to femininity, such as lingerie advertising, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, where we're starting to see female athletes being featured. The bottom ones, Stephanie Gilmore, who's an Australian surfer, her parents described the Roxy ad that she did, where she appeared semi-nude, as cheeky but tasteful. So even her parents thought this was perfectly an acceptable way for her to raise money. And I think it might also be connected to the rise of feisty and feminine female heroes who kick ass in mainstream movies, such as Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games, Wonder Woman, Lara Croft, Charlie's Angels, Xena Princess Warrior, and perhaps even preteen Hit Girl. So I think there are other things going on outside sport that also maybe make this articulation possible. And I also think there's an element that this shift may be a generational shift. So these are some images from the New Zealand women's 15s rugby team. And what I know from other research is that New Zealand women's rugby players in the 80s and 90s felt like they had to dress up in a feminine way to counteract the stereotype that women who played rugby were tough or hard or lesbians. And so today's players, from interviews I've seen with them, for example, don't seem to feel the same way. They seem to dress up because they enjoy dressing up as women, because they're women, and they seem to reject these kind of earlier ideas that dressing up like a woman undermines or diminishes their seriousness as athletes or is necessary to prove their heterosexuality. So, so I think we're in the middle of a shift, whether it stays or whether we start to see other kinds of things developing, obviously, is the main reason that we continue to track media coverage. So so this is the end of the main rules, the 15 rules. But I just want to now shift to maybe if we want to see change, what might be some things that would contribute to that. So this is where my second whakatauki comes in. I orea te tuatara ki patu ki waho. And that means that if we have a problem, we solve it by continuing to try to find solutions, that we try to work together, that we try to understand what's going on. And I like this quote from Tom Forty, who's a UK Telegraph columnist, and he says, "Can men ever really learn to love women's sport?" And I actually wonder if it also might be a connection to narcissism, because men may not follow women's sport because they don't see themselves in women's sport. Some men do, but some men don't. And we also know that female audiences are higher when women are playing. So they're high for the Olympics when there's lots of women being shown and participating. They're high for professional tennis because there's lots of women participating. They're high for netball because it's predominantly women playing. So nobody that I've known has researched this or even looked into it, but just thinking about it, I wonder if there's an element of narcissism there. All right. So this isn't a particularly long section, but it's just to give you some ideas to think about. So just to revisit Stuart Hall's point about articulation again, and why it's so difficult to unpack that sport and masculinity articulation. He says representation is a complex business, especially when dealing with difference, and in our case, gender difference. It engages feelings, attitudes, and emotions, and mobilizes fears and anxieties in the viewer at deeper levels than we can explain in a simple common sense way. And so that, I think, is really important, is that it's that, like that unconscious bias, there's something beneath the surface that is really leading to intense resistance to increasing the coverage of women's sport. But it's very difficult for people to put their finger on what that actually is. So my approach increasingly is taking what's called a strengths and hopes approach. And that means that rather than denying that there's a problem, we actually start in criticizing and telling the media that they're doing a shit job, because we know that hasn't worked very well. They tend to push back fairly significantly when you tell them they're not doing a good job, for example. So instead, this approach focuses on, let's find the bits that are going well. Let's look at what strengths people have in order to be able to change things, what resources they have that they can draw on those in their situations, and maybe how we as researchers or activists or sports organizations can actually help them mobilize those resources. So a couple of key things that I think will help us if we want to create change, and one is whakawhanaungatanga, and that's the Maori concept of the importance of establishing, building and maintaining relationships. So you don't just rock into a media office and say, you guys are doing a bad job, you better buck up and do it better. It's about building relationships of trust, and at the same time, the concept of whakamana, which is the idea of actually esteeming and valuing others and making sure that even when we disagree and even when we agree to disagree, that we maintain their mana and their status rather than pulling them down and devaluing them. So I think if we can take these into the kind of work that we're trying to do, that might actually make a difference. And this is just examples of a range of different groups in New Zealand and powerful organisations that have sprung up around trying to improve the coverage of women's sport, including our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. So here are some things that I think make a difference. So this is Laura Gentili, who's the Senior Vice President, Business Operations and Strategy for ESPNW, and that debuted in 2010, in the end of 2010. So it's just, it's 9 years old now, and it's gone from being a small ESPN sub-branch that focused predominantly on women's sport to a multimedia business encompassing digital, social, television, films, mentorship programs, and events such as the ESPNW Women in Sports Summit. And I went to one of the conferences that they organised around media coverage of women's sport, for example. But the key point from this slide is that ESPN's research shows that both men and women want good stories, interesting stories, in-depth stories, and they don't really care if they're about male athletes or female athletes. So there should be, in principle, no barrier to women's sport getting more coverage. One thing that has become quite clear is that sports organisations are actually enabling the media to treat female athletes as second class and to treat female competitions as less valuable. So one of the things that has been discussed is making sure that sports organisations themselves audit their own decisions so that they can actually create an environment where women's sport has the best chance to get coverage. So I've just put some things up there that sports can do. So for example, number of teams for men and women. So working towards equality in the number of teams of men for both genders. For example, if there are 8 men's teams and 6 women's teams in a league that receives live coverage, this could equal 23 more hours of television coverage from men than the women. So many more hours of opportunities for people to develop relationships with the players, get to know who they are, and actually become fans. Scheduling of events. Nancy Lee from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation pointed out that at the Sochi Olympics, there were no women's events scheduled on the last day when most of the finals are played. So that meant there was no coverage of women's sport on the last day of the Olympics. So her point is, if women's sport is scheduled in the shadow of men's events, it will be treated as second class. One key thing about venues is that men's and women's events need to be in the same venues. So media have limited resources, people, time, travel, etc. So they'll almost always, if they have to make a choice, they'll almost always prioritize men's sports. But if the women are playing in the same stadiums as the men are, it makes it easy for media to cover those events, and it increases the likelihood of women's sport getting coverage. And professional tennis is a really good example of that. Another thing is style of uniforms. Beach volleyball is one example where gender played a major role in diversity. In fact, women's beach volleyball got a lot more coverage than men's beach volleyball because they sexualized the players. Although beach volleyball's expanded their acceptable uniforms now to the point where Muslim players can play fully clothed, for example. Another thing they should look at is putting gender on the agenda in broadcast contracts. So to ensure that broadcasters agree to broadcast men's and women's events. There are a few small things that media can do if gender gets on the agenda for them. So the ESPN announcer in the photograph there said that during the women's Final Four basketball final was absolutely amazing, buzzer-beating scores, exactly the most kind of exciting sport that you can possibly watch. And so she ran into one of her colleagues in the corridor and he said, "Oh, wasn't that amazing? Oh my God, the women's final, it was awesome." And she just turned to him and said, "Yeah, yes, you're going to lead with that in your news story tonight, aren't you?" And he just went, oh, yeah, definitely, right? So if she hadn't actually just put gender on the agenda by raising that point with him, it might not have been the most important story or even got much coverage that day. So it's about making sure that sports media organizations do think about gender when they make their decisions. Another one that I've put there was, and that relates to the order of the stories as well. Another one was a reporter who was surprised to find out that he only used women as 20% of his sources, and he decided he'd try to make that 50%. And he eventually achieved 40%, but he said it was really difficult to find women's sources, which is likely because if women aren't visible in sport, if they're tokens, if they continue to be tokens in sport organizations, in the sport arena, then reporters won't actually know they're existing. So again, that sort of unconscious bias and tokenism probably plays into that. Another one is about having the courage to take a risk. So some of you may know Melody Robinson, ex-New Zealand rugby player, has been a commentator and is now an executive in sports media in New Zealand. So she sort of said the current business models mean that broadcasters are driven by revenue, by yield, which is costs versus revenue, by ratings, and by viewer hours. And she says if you're going to decide to try to cover an emerging women's sport, that requires the courage to broadcast a new opportunity that won't initially meet any of those expectations. And a colleague of mine in the US has pointed out that it took something like 50 years for the NBA to actually get crowds over 5,000. And so men's sport has had 100 more years than women's sport to actually build up its audiences and get to the point where they get big crowds. But somehow women's sport, even when it's just emerging, isn't being given the same kind of opportunity. So she says, take a risk, look outside the business model. And if you project forwards to what the opportunity is, then that's when you start hitting the sweet spot for women's sport. So she gave me the example of, some of you might remember this, that Sky did a new rugby broadcast format where they played 2 double headers of Australia versus New Zealand. The women played first and then the men played afterwards. And they broadcast both events. I went to the one, as you can see from the photographs, that was held at Eden Park. And in both Australia and New Zealand, the women's games broke attendance records at the stadium and pay TV ratings for the women's games. Now, the All Blacks are New Zealand's top rating team, and by far the main audience generator. They gained about 800,000 viewers for those games, and the women pulled in over 500,000, which is a really high rating. So that allowed Melody to say, see, if you do it and give them a chance, you know, there is an audience out there. Also, what Mel's done is launched the Wonderful Group, which is a mentoring program to encourage more women to get involved in sport media, which I think will it's making quite a big impact. And what she's done is brought on a lot of male allies to be mentors. She's worked, when she was at Sky, she worked with the Sky Sport executive, and I'm sure she's doing the same thing now that she's director of Television New Zealand Sport, to actually get them on board that this is a good idea. And I'll explain why it's a good idea in a minute. And then another one is to exploit niche markets, which is what ESPNW did. It said there's a niche market for women's sport. We're going to go out and exploit it. And this has just happened in New Zealand, where the recently launched online news website Newsroom has embraced this opportunity to meet the unmet need for more women's sport. So senior reporter Suzanne McFadden, who's down there on the right, she went to them and said, look, you know, why don't we cover more women's sport? Much to her surprise, they said, sure. Actually, let's just go all out and just do a women's sports section and only do women's sport. And for her, she was surprised, actually. She was excited, and because she said there's so many stories out there to be told, and being able to tell these stories I've been wanting to tell for the last 20 years and not having had the opportunity to do so is just amazing. What's really interesting is there is clearly an unmet need, because women's sport leads the website in readership quite often. And all the stories are shared to Stuff, New Zealand's largest online news site, and they're getting really good pickup there. So, you know, sometimes exploiting niche markets, if you can afford to do that, or if you decide to take a risk, can be really powerful. And the other really main thing is that workplace culture matters. So you do need to actively seek diversity, and you do need to actively seek allies. It's not just enough to bring women in, though, because if lots and lots of sports organizations and sports media organizations have tried to recruit women to become part of the sports media. They've been quite successful in that. What they have not been successful in is keeping them in. And so if women comprise less than 15% of the workforce, they're going to feel like tokens. Their opinions probably won't count. Their ideas don't necessarily get taken seriously. And the whole culture of the organization often tends to be fairly male. And so what happens is women come in and through the revolving door, out they go again, because they say, I do not need to put up with this. This is BS, and away they go and do something else. But there are examples where that's not the case. So Claire Smith, who's the woman on the top left, who works for ESPNW now, she was one of the very early African Americans at all, and African American women to cover baseball. She's now in baseball's Hall of Fame for her sports writing on baseball. And her point is that we need diversity in the sports writers. Most sports writers around the world are over 40, white and male. And she's saying, we need racial diversity, we need gender diversity, we need all kinds of diversity. Because those diverse people can tell different stories. They can have access, and they will think about different kinds of stories than we're currently seeing. And people want to hear those stories. Liz Clark on the right works for the Washington Post, and all their 4 major men's sport teams, so baseball, football, basketball, and I think ice hockey, are all covered by women at the moment. And she said that we don't even think about gender. She says the issue of gender equality has receded into the background because more than 15% of their sports staff are women. And so she said it's so not on the agenda that she didn't even notice that one day recently their whole front sports page was women's sport. She didn't even think about it until someone tweeted that, wow, look, the Washington Post, it's all women's sport. And then in a New Zealand context, I've talked to several people who work in netball broadcasting, and all of them say that it's a really, really good environment to work. And one of them said she never thinks about gender. And she said right from the start, the vibe's been positive, very supportive. The interesting thing is a lot of the crew members, many of whom are men, camera people, soundies, who do lots of different sports. They've always said they love working on the netball because there are fewer egos, everyone gets along, and we've had great times. So what tends to happen is if you have an inclusive workspace, people will stay. And because people will stay, you will get much more diverse kinds of stories, and you'll attract in readers that you might not attract otherwise. However, in New Zealand, in 2007, there was a survey of newspapers done by one of my students that found less than 10% of sports reporters were women. In fact, it was a total of 7 across the country. And that means there's pretty much been no change since I was working as one of only 6 women sports reporters in 1988. So we do have a ways to go. All right, and just to finish, I wanted to conclude with this slide, which kind of gives you an overview of the possible differences between different groups who have an investment in the shared desire of good quality coverage of women's sport. So that idea of whakawhanaungatanga, of talking to each other, of understanding each other, we're not going to make any progress or see major changes unless we can all kind of reach a point where we understand each other and support each other to do this one thing that I think we're pretty much all agreed we should be doing. So I'm happy to discuss, I'm just going to close this actually, and then I'll come back to you. Hold on one second. What I wanted to say was I'm really happy to discuss any of these examples or issues that are raised in the lecture during the 1 to 2 p.m. optional Zoom meeting that will follow the lecture on Monday. And this lecture, I'm going to stop sharing, come here. Right, there we go. And this lecture actually, it's seriously only scratching the surface of of what we know, but hopefully it's given you some insight into how sportswomen are represented, and some of the reasons why, and what might need to change for women to become normalized as part of the sports media furniture. So yeah, I'm happy to talk to you. I hope to talk to you all between 1 and 2. Bring your questions and I'll do my best to answer them. All right, see you later.